You are welcome to the second lecture of week 2. Our topic is Origin of Western Science in Ancient Times. I am Nora Onwumelu. In this lecture, you will learn how Western science originated in ancient times. You will also be introduced to how science originated and how it evolved to its present state. Please bear in mind that when we talk about the origin of science, we are in essence talking about the origin of the scientific method. Earlier in this course, we defined science in terms of the method of acquiring knowledge of nature. From the time of recorded history to the early 16th century AD, Western science progressed very slowly. It was the emergence of this method of science in the 17th century that enabled science to achieve the impressive success it has achieved today. This topic is important because it will help you to appreciate how logical thinking is of indispensable value to man. It is also important because it will expose the mistakes of the past and enable us to learn from them. The history of Western science is going to be discussed in 3 phases. 1. Origin of Western science in ancient times, beginning of recorded history to about 476 AD. 2. Science in the Middle Ages of Europe, 476 to 1400 AD. 3. Rise of modern science, 1400 AD to the present time, which dates from the 20th century scientific revolution. However, you should note that the division of history into these periods is only a guide to help historians. There was no such clear-cut division of time in history, rather one period merged into the next. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Write briefly on the contributions of ancient Egyptians and Babylonians to science. 2. Discuss vividly how tales of Miletus, Anaximander, and Pythagoras explained the fundamental component of matter. 3. Identify the contributions of the Roman Empire to science. Ancient science. The origin of science is often traced to the Egyptians and to the Babylonians. They originated science during the Neolithic age when they settled down to an organized agricultural life and activity. It has been possible to infer that the content of science in these areas was from archaeological remains. This is because writing as we know it today had not been discovered then. It is important to note that the disciplines we call science today separated gradually from philosophy. Thus, at the time of the Egyptians and Babylonians, people who studied plants, animals, stars, and other heavenly bodies, rocks, soils, etc., were all called philosophers. There was nothing like a botanist, zoologist, astronomer, etc. It was in Alexandrian Academy in Egypt that specializations started. The kingdom of Egypt was divided into 3 religious centers, which were Memphis, Heliopolis, Thebes or Hermopolis. These centers were administered by priest scholars. They were called scholars because they were the intellectual class of the ancient Egyptians. These priest scholars established a kind of school system known as the Egyptian Mystery System schools. These schools served as universities where every known discipline was taught by the priests. Examples were philosophy, medicine, law, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, etc. This group of disciplines were referred to as the wisdom of the Egyptians. Thus, a lot of ancient Egyptian science was studied as sacred knowledge, and such knowledge was possessed and disseminated by the priests. One of the main stimuli for the origin of ancient Egyptian science was their practical needs in agriculture, such as measuring, calculations, surveying, and study of the weather and the heavens. Second is their understanding of the world they lived in through religion and philosophy. Astronomy originated with the Egyptians through their study of the heavens, the stars, and the weather. They knew that the best time to plant their crops was right after the Nile River overflowed its banks. Their priests noticed that between each overflow, the moon rose 12 times. So they counted 12 moons or months and figured out when the Nile would rise again. Their accuracy in these predictions led to their invention of the lunar calendar. They divided the year into 12 moons or months of 30 days each and added a space of 5 days to each year, thus bringing each year to a total of 365 days. Credit is also given to the Egyptians for the origination of mathematics. The evidence was the finding of the Rhind mathematical papyrus, which was written during the reign of King Al-Uzareh in 1650 BC. It contained arithmetical problems and solutions involving the use of fractions and decimals. Another ancient text which contains evidence of Egyptian origin of the sciences is the famous writings of Hermes Trismegistus, which contain, among other works, books on medicine, physics, and chemistry, then called alchemy. The theory of transmutation of elements, which is the basis of modern chemistry, first appeared among ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians were also reputed highly in medicine. They were said to have performed caesarean operations and removed cataracts from the eyes. Evidence for this is contained in the Edwin Papyrus, which was excavated. Do you know that the first physician of the ancient world and the most famous was the black Egyptian called Imhotep? He lived about 2980 BC. He was called the god of medicine by the Greeks, and he lived 2000 years before the Greek doctor Hippocrates, who in modern times is called the father of medicine. The Egyptians also invented writing called hieroglyphics and paper called papyrus, on which they recorded their ideas and culture. Babylonia, which is present-day Iraq. The sciences of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering also developed in Babylonia about 1800 to 1600 BC. The Babylonians believed that the heavens were the abode of their gods. They also believed that terrestrial disasters such as floods, insect attacks, and storms were caused by these gods. Thus, they studied heavenly events carefully in order to know when their gods were angry so as to pacify them. Out of these practices grew a descriptive astronomy that was the most sophisticated of the ancient world until the Greeks took it over and perfected it. The first accurate astronomical observation they recorded was the rising and setting of the planet Venus. The Babylonians also realized the importance of fixed units of physical measurement. Their unit of length was the finger. The foot contained 20 fingers, the cubit 30 fingers. The measurements of weight were the grain, the shekel, and the talent, while their medium of exchange was the belly. Their land was harsh and was made habitable by extensive damming and irrigation works from their two great rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. Mathematics thrived under these conditions. For instance, they needed to calculate the volume of dirt to be removed from canals and the provision necessary for work parties. It might be interesting to you to know that they were the first to divide the day into hours, minutes, and seconds, and also divided the circle into 360 degrees. You will agree that the Egyptians and the Babylonians were observers of nature, and they gave precise descriptions. What was missing was scientific explanations. To them, all knowledge was attributed to the revelations of their gods. They believed that it was the function of religion and magic to understand nature, but that man could describe it and use it. Ancient Greeks. Through the influence of Egypt and Babylonia, the Greeks acquired knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, and developed these to an unprecedented degree. Science in ancient Greece will be treated under two headings. 1. Pre-Socratic philosopher-scientists, and 2. Socratic philosopher-scientists. Pre-Socrates. These people were known as natural philosophers because they engaged themselves with the study of nature and the origin of the world. They were 10 in number, and they included Thales of Miletus, who is a Phoenician who migrated to Miletus in Ionia. Anaximander, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and Democritus were Ionian philosophers. These men are usually called early Greek philosophers by some historians, while some others are consistent in noting their non-Greek origin. They studied in Egypt elsewhere under the same curriculum. After their studies, they went back to their respective countries to expand the teachings of the Egyptian Mystery System School. They were more concerned with the phenomena of change. They observed that physical substances, that is, matter, change into one another. But their main concern was to find out the original stuff from which all substances originated and to which they return. Has such a thought ever come to your mind? They attempted to answer this question and named the world stuff, each in his own way. Let us now take a look at each of these men. Thales of Miletus. He is usually referred to as the father of Western philosophy. He taught that water was the source of all things in the universe. According to Aristotle, Thales got this idea from seeing that the nutriment of all things is moisture, and that water is the origin of the nature of moist things. Things that exist in the world are solid, liquid, or gaseous in form. Water, according to Thales, underlies these forms and change from one form to another. Thales also forecast the eclipse of 585 BC, although knowledge about eclipses were far advanced in Egypt where he studied. Anaximander. He was a pupil of Thales in the Milesian school. He was quick to argue that water could not be the basic substance because water is essentially wet and nothing can be its own contradiction. According to him, if Thales were correct, the opposite of wet could not exist in a substance, and that would preclude all the dry things in the world. Therefore, Thales was wrong. Here was the birth of the critical tradition that is fundamental to the advance of science. On his own part, he called the world stuff the infinite something. This expresses the idea that the original stuff had no beginning, was imperishable, inexhaustible, and indestructible. He was also the first among the Greeks to represent the earth on a map, though the science of map making, which is cartography, was known in Egypt and Babylonia. Pythagoras. He spent 22 years in Egypt and received instruction in mathematics, physics, theology, music, philosophy, and ethics from the pre-scholars of the Mystery System schools. The mathematical theory called Pythagorean theory is named after him. For him, all things are numbers. He believed that the universe was composed of numbers in various shapes, squares, cubes, oblong, triangular, etc. To him, all things in the universe were numerable and could be counted. His followers, called Pythagoreans, believed that the unit 1 is the source of all numbers, and they divided it into odd and even numbers. This whole story is interesting, isn't it? Heraclitus. For him, the world stuff is divine fire. He was the first Greek to advance the principle of change as a universal law. Change, he said, is the only reality, and that there is nothing permanent in the world. According to him, from life comes death. From death comes life. Sleep changes into wakefulness, and wakefulness changes into sleep. Everything in the universe, he says, has its own opposite. Democritus. He was a disciple of Leucippus, who is credited with the founding of the atomic theory, or the doctrine of matter. He became the ablest and best-known interpreter of the atomic theory. He proposed that matter is made up of atoms, and they are infinite in number, and too small to be perceived by the senses. He said that atoms differ in size, some bigger, some smaller, and that there is empty space between them. According to him, everything new is produced from a combination of atoms, and the death or cessation takes place when atoms separate. So, you can see that even the atomic theory was known in the ancient times. This effort of the Greeks to explain the basic components of matter is important in the history of scientific thought. This is because they try to reason and to explain it in seemingly simpler terms. After the pre-Socrates came the Socrates. They included Socrates himself, Plato, and Aristotle. Plato studied in Egypt, but history is silent on whether Socrates and Aristotle also studied in Egypt. We shall discuss them one after the other. Socrates. He was the teacher of Plato and was born in Athens. He was a moral teacher and sought truth by asking questions. He enriched science with the tools of universal definitions and inductive reasoning. Plato. After his studies in Egypt, Plato returned to Athens and opened a school called the Academy. He taught that it was more noble and dignified to seek answers by reasoning rather than by experiments. He loved mathematics, and he formulated the idea of negative numbers. His academy also produced philosopher-scientists such as Heraclides of Pontus, who suggested that the earth rotates on its own axis once in every 24 hours, and that Mercury and Venus circle round the sun like satellites. Aristotle. He was the most accomplished of Plato's pupils. He was born at Stagira in Macedonia. He was a tutor of Alexander the Great. He wrote books on almost all the areas of knowledge: biology, botany, anatomy, physics, metaphysics, astronomy, mathematics, logic, economics, politics, law, psychology, etc. His influence on subsequent development of science and philosophy was enormous. In particular, his views on physics and astronomy controlled the view most men had of the universe for 2,000 years. However, to him, the proper means of investigation was observation. Generally speaking, Greek science was said to be more of a speculative and theoretical activity rather than experimental and practical. Next, you will learn about the contributions of Rome to science. Science in the Roman period. 50 BC to 400 AD. The last and the most important of ancient civilizations in Europe was the Roman Empire. People of many different races came under its rule: the English, the French, Arabians, Syrians, Greeks, etc. The Roman Empire, however, did not have much influence in the development of science. It was more interested in conquests and maintenance of power through political and military administration. The spirit of independent research was quite foreign to the Roman mind, so scientific innovation was interrupted for a while. However, some scientific works were produced during this period, but none of them was revolutionary in nature. They were mainly a detailed explanation of scientific conceptions already developed in Alexandria or Greece. These include geographical science, medical education and healthcare, and Pliny's natural history. Geographical science. The wars and military expeditions of the Romans yielded much further geographical knowledge to mankind. Nations or countries which were relatively unknown entered the world map. Julius Caesar, one of the emperors, gave the world its present calendar called the Julian calendar in 46 BC. In this calendar, the length of the year is fixed at 365 days and at 366 days at every fourth year. There were 12 calendar months of 30 and 31 days, except for February, which has 28 days. However, February has 29 days at every fourth year or leap year. The month of July is also named after Julius Caesar. Additionally, Pope Gregory III made a slight innovation to the Julian calendar. He made the leap year occur in any year whose number is exactly divisible by 4. The only exception is the centenary years whose numbers are not exactly divisible by 400. For instance, 1800, 1900. The revised calendar is called the Gregorian calendar. Medical education and healthcare. The Romans of this period also established hospitals and paid physicians who worked there. They also promoted public health, hygiene, and sanitation. Pliny's natural history. Pliny promoted the development of natural history. He wrote a book on natural history, and the topics of discussion in it were on animals and plants, especially medicinal plants and their uses. The book was a compilation of 2,000 works by 146 Roman and 326 Greek authors. We can see so far that both scientific research and theoretical science were in decline under the Roman Empire. The advances they made were more of a practical nature. This unit has introduced you to how science originated in Egypt, Babylonia, and how the sciences were advanced further in Greece and in Roman Empire. You have also been informed that Western philosophy and science owe their origins to Egypt. The main points in this unit are: 1. Science originated in Egypt and Babylonia, which is present-day Iraq. 2. Egyptian pre-scholars established a kind of school known as the Egyptian Mystery System Schools, where every known discipline was taught by the priests. 3. Evidence for the Egyptian origins of mathematics and medicine can be found in the Rhind mathematical papyrus and the Edwin papyrus, respectively. 4. Babylonians developed the most descriptive astronomy of the ancient world. 5. They were the first to divide the day into hours, minutes, and seconds, and also divided the circle into 360 degrees. 6. Egyptian philosophy is the origin of Western philosophy. Evidence can be found in the writings of ancient Greeks themselves, such as Homer and Pythagoras, and from modern historians such as William Stace and James Henry Breasted. 7. Pre-Socratics named the original stuff from which all things originated and to which they return. The names given were Water by Tales of Miletus, Infinite Something by Anaximander, Number by Pythagoras, Divine Fire by Heraclitus, and Atoms by Democritus. We also learned that 1. Socrates enriched science with universal definitions and inductive reasoning. 2. Plato formulated the idea of negative numbers. 3. Aristotle wrote books on almost all the areas of knowledge. 4. Scientific innovation began to decline in the Roman Empire. And 5. The calendar invented by the Egyptians were modified further by Julius Caesar and Pope Gregory III. Thank you for participating in our lectures. Bye-bye.